The letter clutched in Garrett Adams' weathered hand seemed to mock him as he stood on the wooden platform of Idaho City, Idaho's train station, in the spring of 1875. The distant whistle of the approaching locomotive sent a flutter of nerves through his stomach that he hadn't felt since his first cattle drive. At 30 years old, with his own modest ranch finally turning a profit, Garrett had taken the most daring step of his life advertising for a mail-order bride. "Trains coming in right on schedule," the station master called out, checking his pocket watch with an air of importance. Garrett nodded, running a hand through his sun-bleached brown hair. The letter had been clear. Miss Daria Novak would be arriving on the 3 o'clock train from San Francisco. The arrangement had been made through an agency specializing in bringing European women to the American West, and all he knew about his future wife was contained in a single paragraph, and a small tintype photograph showing a slender young woman with serious eyes and dark hair pulled back severely from her face. As the train hissed to a stop, belching steam across the platform, Garrett straightened his best shirt and adjusted his neckerchief. Passengers began to disembark: a businessman in a fine suit, a family with 3 small children, 2 elderly women chatting rapidly. And then, standing alone on the platform with a single trunk at her feet, he saw her. She was dressed in a simple dark blue traveling dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. Though travel-worn, her posture remained dignified as her eyes scanned the crowd. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 22 or 23, and far more beautiful than the grainy tintype had suggested. Gathering his courage, Garrett stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Novak," he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm Garrett Adams." The woman's eyes, deep brown and framed by long lashes, widened slightly. She tilted her head and replied in a language that sounded nothing like English. Her voice was melodic but utterly incomprehensible to his ears. Garrett blinked, suddenly understanding the peculiar phrasing in the agency's letters. They hadn't mentioned a language barrier because they'd assumed he knew she was from Bohemia, a place he'd had to look up in the town's only atlas. The realization hit him like a kick from a stubborn mule. His bride-to-be didn't speak a word of English. "You're Daria," he tried again, gesturing toward her. Her expression brightened with recognition at her name. "Ano Daria Novak," she replied with a small nod and a tentative smile. A flicker of panic rose in Garrett's chest. How were they supposed to build a life together if they couldn't even speak to one another? The agency had clearly misrepresented the situation, but as he looked at the young woman's hopeful yet uncertain expression, he couldn't bring himself to show his dismay. "Well then," he said, mustering a smile and gesturing toward her trunk, "welcome to Idaho City." As he lifted her trunk, Daria reached for a smaller satchel, clutching it tightly to her chest. She followed him toward his wagon, maintaining a careful distance. The spring air carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of hammering echoed from a new construction on Main Street. Garrett helped her up onto the wagon seat, noticing how she tensed slightly at his touch. Once seated, she gazed around at the town with undisguised curiosity. Idaho City had grown considerably since the gold rush days, but it was still a far cry from the European cities she'd likely known. As they rode through town, Garrett pointed to various buildings, naming them in English despite knowing she couldn't understand. General store, bank, sheriff's office. It felt better than silence, and he caught her watching his lips intently as though trying to memorize the strange sounds. The journey to his ranch took nearly an hour, following a winding dirt road that climbed gently into the foothills. Garrett's land wasn't the largest in the territory, but the two-story house he'd built with his own hands stood solidly against the backdrop of pines, with a barn and corral nearby. A small garden plot, still dormant from winter, waited for spring planting. When they arrived, Daria's eyes widened as she took in the property. Garrett couldn't tell if her expression held approval or dismay, but he hoped it was the former. This was to be her home now, after all. "This is it," he said unnecessarily, helping her down from the wagon. "The Adams Ranch." Inside the house, he showed her to the bedroom he'd prepared, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the plainness of the furnishings. He'd added some touches. He thought a woman might appreciate a colorful quilt on the bed, curtains on the windows, a mirror on the wall, but the room remained unmistakably frontier in its simplicity. Daria stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped before her. After a moment, she turned to him and spoke a sentence in her native tongue. Though he couldn't understand the words, her grateful tone and small smile conveyed her meaning. "You're welcome," he replied, then pointed to himself. "Garrett," he pointed to her. "Daria." Then he gestured broadly. "Home." Her smile deepened slightly, revealing a dimple in her left cheek. "Domov," she repeated softly. That night, Garrett slept on a bedroll in the main room, giving Daria privacy in the bedroom. As he stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaking of the house settling, he tried to imagine how strange everything must seem to her, the vast emptiness of the landscape, compared to the crowded streets of Europe, the wooden buildings instead of stone, and most of all, the unfamiliar language surrounding her. An idea began to form in his mind. If she couldn't learn English overnight, perhaps he could learn her language instead. The next morning, Garrett woke before dawn, as was his habit. He had chores to attend to, livestock to feed, fences to mend, but before setting out, he built a fire in the stove and set coffee to brew. He was arranging some biscuits left from the previous day when Daria appeared in the doorway, already dressed in a simple work dress, her hair neatly braided. "Good morning," he said, gesturing toward the table. She nodded. "Dobre rano," she replied. Garrett paused, then attempted to repeat the phrase. "Dobre rano." His pronunciation must have been terrible, for Daria's hand flew to her mouth, but her eyes crinkled with amusement rather than mockery. She repeated it more slowly, and he tried again, managing a slightly better attempt. This small exchange set the pattern for the days that followed. Garrett would point to objects around the ranch, and Daria would provide the Bohemian word. He kept a small notebook in his pocket, writing down phonetic spellings as best he could. In return, he would tell her the English words, which she repeated with increasing accuracy. Daria quickly proved herself hardworking and adaptable. She took over the household tasks without complaint, and soon the ranch house was cleaner than it had ever been. She discovered his meager supply of vegetables in the root cellar, and somehow transformed them into flavorful stews that were unlike anything he'd tasted before. Each evening, they would sit at the kitchen table after supper, sometimes with the Bible open between them, one of the few books Garrett owned that Daria seemed to recognize. She would point to a verse in the English text, then find the corresponding passage in a small Bohemian prayer book she'd brought with her. Through this painstaking method, they both began to learn more words. 2 weeks after her arrival, Garrett took Daria into town for supplies. The curious stares of the townspeople made her shrink closer to his side as they walked to the general store. Inside, Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor's wife, approached them immediately. "So this is your bride," she exclaimed, examining Daria with undisguised curiosity. "We've been simply dying to meet her. What's her name again, and where is she from?" "This is Daria," Garrett replied, noticing how Daria tensed beside him. "She's from Bohemia." "How exotic, Mrs." Patterson turned to Daria and spoke very slowly and loudly, as though volume might bridge the language gap. "Welcome to Idaho City." Daria managed a polite smile and nodded, but Garrett could see her discomfort. "She doesn't speak English yet, Mrs. Patterson, but she understands more than you might think," Garrett said, surprising himself with his protective tone. "Oh, the poor dear," Mrs. Patterson replied. "How difficult that must be for you both." Garrett shrugged. "We're managing just fine." He placed a hand lightly on Daria's back. "I'm learning her language too." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. "You're learning Bohemian? Goodness, what an unusual approach." "Check," Garrett corrected, remembering Daria's explanation through gestures and drawings. "She calls it Czech." As they left the store with their supplies, Daria glanced at him. "Dekuji," she said softly. "You're welcome," he replied, then tried the Czech equivalent he'd learned. "Prosim." Her smile was worth every tongue-twisted attempt at her language. That night, as they sat by the fire, Daria reached into her satchel and removed a small book. She handed it to Garrett, her expression both shy and hopeful. The book was worn, its pages yellowed with age. Opening it, he found it was filled with colorful illustrations of animals, plants, and everyday objects, with Czech words printed beneath each picture. "A primer?" he asked, looking up at her. Daria nodded, pointing to herself and then to him. "Uchitel," she said, "teacher." Over the following weeks, their language lessons became more structured. Each morning, as they worked side by side, Daria would name the tools they used and the animals they tended. Each evening, they would pore over her primer, with Daria patiently correcting Garrett's pronunciation. As spring blossomed into summer, so did their communication. They were far from fluent in each other's languages, but they had developed a unique blend of English, Czech, and gestures that served them well. More importantly, they had begun to understand each other beyond words. The furrow in Daria's brow when she was concentrating, the way Garrett whistled when he was pleased with a day's work. They still maintained separate sleeping arrangements, though they were legally married. Garrett had not pressed the matter, sensing Daria's need for time to adjust to her new life and to know him better. The marriage certificate, signed the day after her arrival with the help of a judge who asked few questions, hung framed on the wall, a reminder of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. One evening in late June, as fireflies began to appear in the twilight, they sat on the porch steps, enjoying the cooler air after a hot day. Daria had been unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Krasne," she said finally, gesturing toward the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Beautiful," Garrett agreed, then added in Czech, "Jako tai." "Like you," Daria turned to him, surprise evident in her expression. It was the first compliment of that nature he had ventured. A blush crept across her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Why did you come here?" Garrett asked, a question that had been on his mind for months. He used a combination of English and the Czech words he knew, supplemented with gestures. Daria was silent for a long moment. Then, haltingly, using their blended language, she began to explain. Her village had suffered bad harvests for 2 years running. Her parents had died of fever the previous winter. Her older brother had a growing family of his own to feed. The agency's advertisement had offered passage to America and the promise of a new life. "Lepší život," she said softly. "A better life. Is it?" Garrett asked, gesturing around them. "Better." Daria considered the question, her gaze traveling from the house to the land beyond and finally back to his face. "Ano," she said firmly. "Better." Something shifted between them that evening, a new understanding, a deeper connection. When Daria reached out and briefly touched his hand before rising to go inside, Garrett felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air. The following Sunday, they attended church in town as usual. Afterward, several families invited them to stay for a picnic on the church grounds. It was during this gathering that Garrett first noticed how much Daria's English had improved. She was able to exchange simple pleasantries with the other women, and even laughed at a joke one of the children told. "Your wife is making wonderful progress with her English," Reverend Tompkins commented to Garrett. "She's a quick learner," Garrett replied proudly. "And I hear you're learning her language as well. That's quite admirable." Garrett shrugged. "Seemed only fair. She left everything behind to come here." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "Marriage is about meeting in the middle. I've always believed. Too many men expect their wives to do all the adapting." Across the churchyard, Daria was helping Mrs. Tompkins serve lemonade. Her dark hair gleamed in the sunlight, and her smile as she handed a cup to a young child made something tighten in Garrett's chest. "You know," the Reverend continued, "when you first brought her to church, some folks wondered if this arrangement would work out. A mail-order bride who couldn't speak English, but looking at you both now." He clapped Garrett on the shoulder. "I'd say the Lord knew what he was doing." On the ride home, Daria seemed thoughtful. When they were nearly to the ranch, she suddenly spoke. "The women," she began carefully in English, "they ask many questions about us." Garrett glanced at her. "What kind of questions?" She hesitated, searching for the words. "They ask if we are happy together." She switched to Czech, adding words he had come to understand. "They think it is strange that we married without knowing each other, without speaking the same language." "And what did you tell them?" Garrett asked, his heart beating a little faster. Daria looked directly at him. "I told them yes, we are learning the language and—" She gestured between them, each other. That night, as Garrett prepared his bedroll in the main room as usual, Daria appeared in the bedroom doorway. She had changed into her nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Garrett," she said softly, "prayed Sem. Come here." He stood frozen for a moment, then slowly crossed the room to her. She took his hand and led him into the bedroom they had legally shared for months, but had never truly occupied together. "JSI Mudge Manjel," she said. "You are my husband." "Atai JSI Moj Gina," he replied, the Czech words coming naturally now. "And you are my wife." When Daria reached up to touch his face, Garrett felt as though every moment since her arrival had been leading to this, not just the physical joining, but the true beginning of their marriage. When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of a man who had learned patience, and the passion of one who had found something precious beyond words in any language. As summer gave way to autumn, the rhythm of life on the ranch changed with the season. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. Garrett and Daria worked side by side to prepare for winter, harvesting the garden, preserving food, cutting and stacking firewood, mending the barn roof. Their languages continued to blend and grow. Garrett could now carry on simple conversations in Czech, while Daria's English improved daily. But more significant was the language they had created between themselves, a touch on the arm to signal caution, a certain smile that meant private thoughts would be shared later, a way of working together that required few words at all. In early October, they traveled to Boise for supplies that couldn't be found in Idaho City. The larger town bustled with activity, and Daria moved through the crowded streets with newfound confidence, her hand tucked securely in the crook of Garrett's arm. At the mercantile, as Garrett discussed an order for winter supplies with the shopkeeper, he was surprised to hear Daria engaged in animated conversation with a woman near the fabric display. The stranger was speaking to Daria in fluent Czech, and Daria's face was alight with the joy of speaking her native tongue freely. "Garrett," Daria called to him excitedly, "Pojď sem, come here. This is Mrs. Svoboda. She is from Prague, Mrs. Svoboda, a plump, cheerful woman in her 40s, extended her hand to Garrett. "Your wife tells me you have been learning our language," she said in accented but clear English. "That is most unusual and most kind." "It seemed the right thing to do," Garrett replied, shaking her hand. "My husband and I have lived in Boise for 15 years, Mrs. Svoboda explained. "We have a small bakery on Pine Street. You must come visit before you return home." Later that afternoon, they found themselves in the warm, fragrant interior of Svoboda's bakery, where Mr. Svoboda, a broad-shouldered man with a generous mustache, greeted them heartily in Czech. For the first time since her arrival in America, Daria was able to converse freely, without the careful consideration of each word that had become her habit. Watching her animated gestures and hearing her laughter as she spoke with the Svobodas, Garrett realized how much she had been holding back. Her English, while improving, still constrained her true personality. Here, among countrymen, she blossomed before his eyes, witty, expressive, full of life. "Your wife is delightful," Mrs. Svoboda told Garrett as Daria and Mr. Svoboda discussed different types of pastry. "She tells me how you have been teaching each other. This is very special, Mr. Adams." "She's taught me more than just her language," Garrett admitted. Mrs. Svoboda nodded knowingly. "The heart learns faster than the tongue, yes." When they prepared to leave, Mrs. Svoboda pressed a package of pastries into Daria's hands and then surprised her with a book, a Czech-English dictionary. "For both of you," she said. "And please, you must write to us, perhaps visit again in the spring." On the journey back to Idaho City, Daria seemed both elated and pensive. "It was good to speak Czech so much," she said, leaning against Garrett's shoulder as he drove the wagon. "But strange, too." "Strange how?" he asked. She considered this. "Because Idaho is home now," she replied in English. "With you." As winter settled over the mountains, bringing snow that sometimes isolated them for days, Garrett and Daria found comfort in their shared life. The dictionary became a treasured possession, consulted often as they read together in the evenings by lamplight. Their conversations flowed more easily, alternating between English and Czech, sometimes within the same sentence. One stormy December night, as wind howled around the eaves of the house, they lay curled together beneath the quilts, the warmth of their bodies creating a cocoon against the cold. "Tell me about Christmas in Bohemia," Garrett requested, his fingers tracing idle patterns on Daria's arm. She described traditions, unlike anything he had known Karp kept in the bathtub, before being prepared for the Christmas Eve feast. The baking of special cookies called vanilkové roličky, children looking for a golden pig that was said to bring good luck. "We had an Advent wreath, like the one I made for us," she continued, referring to the evergreen circle with candles that now adorned their table. "And we would put hay under the tablecloth to remember the manger where Jesus was born." "We can do that," Garrett said. "Whatever traditions you want to keep." Daria shifted to look at him. "And American traditions, too. I want to learn them all." On Christmas Eve, they blended both worlds. Daria prepared a feast that included dishes from her homeland alongside a roast chicken and Garrett's mother's recipe for corn pudding. They placed hay beneath the tablecloth and lit all 4 candles on the Advent wreath. After dinner, they exchanged simple gifts, a hand-tooled leather belt Daria had secretly commissioned in Boise for Garrett, and for her, a delicate silver locket containing a tiny photograph of them both, taken during their trip to Boise. "There is one more gift," Daria said shyly, taking Garrett's hand and placing it on her abdomen. "A baby. In summer." Garrett stared at her, momentarily speechless, then gathered her into his arms with a whoop of joy that startled the cat dozing by the fire. "A baby," he repeated in wonder, his hand still resting where their child grew. "Are you certain, Anno?" She nodded, her eyes bright. "Mrs. Svoboda helped me be sure when we were in boys. I wanted to wait until Christmas to tell you." "Budu Oduk," Garrett said in Czech. "I will be a father." "Aja Budu Matka," Daria replied, "and I will be a mother." The winter passed in a state of joyful anticipation. As Daria's body changed, Garrett found himself more protective than ever, insisting on taking over the more strenuous chores despite her protests that women in her village worked right up until childbirth. "Not with me, they don't," he declared, gently but firmly steering her away from the heavy wash bucket she was attempting to lift. Daria rolled her eyes but allowed him to take it. "You Americans, so careful with your women." "Not all American men," he corrected her. "Just this one, with his woman." By spring, Daria's condition was obvious, and the women of Idaho City rallied around her. Mrs. Patterson organized a quilting bee to create a blanket for the baby, using the occasion to ply Daria with advice about childbirth and infant care. Though some of the older women were still perplexed by Garrett's insistence on learning Czech, most had come to admire the unusual couple. "Never seen a man so devoted," Mrs. Jenkins remarked to the other women as they watched Garrett help Daria into the wagon after church one Sunday. "Learning her foreign tongue and all. My Harold wouldn't bother to learn French if I spoke it, let alone something as peculiar as Bohemian." "I think it's romantic," sighed young Abigail Turner, who at 16 was enthralled by any hint of unusual love stories. "Like something from a novel." Mrs. Patterson nodded sagely. "They've certainly proved the doubters wrong. Remember how everyone said it wouldn't last?" In late June, just as the wildflowers were painting the meadows in brilliant colors, Daria went into labor. Garrett sent a ranch hand racing to fetch the midwife from town, then paced anxiously outside the bedroom door as the two women he had managed to summon from neighboring homesteads assisted Daria through the early stages. When Mrs. Holloway, the midwife, finally arrived, she shooed Garrett downstairs with a firm command to boil water and then stay out of the way. The hours that followed were the longest of his life. Daria's cries tore at his heart, and more than once he started up the stairs, only to be intercepted by one of the neighbor women coming down for supplies. "She's asking for you," Mrs. Prescott told him as the sun began to set. "Mrs. Holloway says it's nearly time, and she's calling for you in that language of yours." When Garrett entered the bedroom, he found Daria pale and exhausted, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She reached for his hand, gripping it with surprising strength as another contraction seized her. "Zustin C.M. new," she gasped. "Stay with me." "I'm here," he promised, sitting beside her and smoothing her hair back from her face. "Right here." "Mr. Adams, if you're staying, make yourself useful," Mrs. Holloway instructed, positioning herself at the foot of the bed. "Support her back when she pushes." What followed was both terrifying and miraculous. Garrett held Daria as she labored to bring their child into the world, whispering encouragement in both English and Czech. When at last the baby's cry pierced the room, Daria collapsed back against him, tears streaming down her face. "A fine boy, Mrs. Holloway announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean cloth. "Strong lungs on him, too." When the midwife placed their son in Daria's arms, Garrett felt a surge of emotion unlike anything he had experienced before. The tiny face, red and wrinkled, bore a distinct resemblance to Daria's brother as pictured in the small portrait she had brought with her. "He's perfect," Garrett whispered, reaching out to touch the downy head with a reverent finger. "Thank you." Daria looked up at him, exhaustion giving way to a radiant smile. What shall we name him? They had discussed names during the long winter evenings, Czech names, American names, family names from both sides. Now, looking at their son, Garrett knew. Daniel, he suggested. Daniel Thomas Adams. Daniel had been her father's name, Thomas his own father's. Daniel, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. Yes, perfect. Later that night, after the women had gone and Daria and the baby were sleeping, Garrett sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, how a simple advertisement placed in desperation had led to the greatest joy he had ever known. When he had sent for a bride, he had expected companionship, perhaps eventually affection. He had not expected to learn a new language, to discover a whole world through Daria's eyes, or to feel this overwhelming love for both her and their child. The years that followed brought changes, both expected and surprising. Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious boy who slipped effortlessly between English and Czech, sometimes creating hybrid sentences that made sense only to his parents. 2 years after his birth, he was joined by a sister, Eva Grace, who inherited her mother's dark eyes and her father's determined nature. The Adams ranch prospered. Garrett's careful management and Daria's European farming knowledge proved a successful combination. They added a room to the house, expanded the barn, and increased their cattle herd. Daria planted fruit trees that within a few years provided apples, pears, and cherries, which she preserved using methods her grandmother had taught her. Their home became a gathering place for neighbors and friends, particularly during holidays when Daria's cooking drew appreciative crowds. The Svobodas visited regularly, bringing news from the growing Czech community in boys and books for the children in both languages. Garrett and Daria continued their language exchange, though now they were both fluent enough that the formal lessons had given way to casual conversation in whichever tongue suited the moment. Sometimes Garrett would catch himself thinking in Czech, particularly when working with the animals or addressing the children. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Daria with a gift he had been planning for months. With the help of Mr. Svoboda, who had connections to shipping companies, he had arranged for Daria's brother and his family to visit from Bohemia. When Joseph Novak stepped off the train in Boise with his wife and 3 children, Daria's joyful tears spoke more eloquently than any words in either language could have done. The 2 families spent a month together, the cousins quickly overcoming the language barrier in the way that only children can, while the adults shared stories and strengthened bonds that distance had strained but never broken. On the final evening of Joseph's visit, as they sat on the porch watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Daria's brother turned to Garrett. When Daria wrote that she had married an American cowboy who was learning Czech, I thought perhaps she was exaggerating to make me feel better about her situation, he admitted in his native tongue, which Garrett now understood perfectly. But seeing you together, hearing you speak our language so well, I understand now why she is so happy here. Garrett smiled, his arm around Daria's shoulders. I was lucky, he replied in Czech. She could have turned around and taken the next train back to San Francisco when she realized I couldn't understand a word she said. Daria laughed. I considered it, she teased, then grew serious. But there was something in your eyes. Kindness, patience. I thought this man will try. And you did more than try. Later that night, after their guests had retired and the children were asleep, Garrett and Daria stood together under a sky brilliant with stars. You ever regret it? He asked quietly. Coming to a strange country, marrying a man you had never met. Daria turned in his arms to face him. At 32, she was more beautiful to him than she had been at 22, her face now bearing the subtle marks of motherhood and laughter, her eyes holding the depth of shared experiences. "Not for one moment," she replied firmly. "Everything I am now, everything we have built together, this is more than I could have imagined when I boarded that train. Even though I still can't pronounce Arhachek correctly," he asked with a smile, referring to the notoriously difficult Czech consonant that had defeated him for years. She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch yard. "Especially because you still try, every day." In that moment, under the vast Idaho sky, Garrett reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. He had sought a wife and found so much more: a partner, a teacher, a bridge to a world he would never have known otherwise. Learning Daria's language had been just the beginning of understanding her heart, and through that understanding, he had discovered the true meaning of home, not a place, but a connection that transcended words in any language. As the years passed, Daniel and Eva grew up bilingual, moving effortlessly between their two cultural heritages. Daniel showed a natural affinity for ranching, working alongside his father from an early age, while Eva displayed her mother's quick mind and love of books. Both children attended the local school, where they sometimes acted as impromptu interpreters when new Czech families arrived in the area, drawn by the growing community. The 19th century gave way to the 20th, bringing changes to Idaho City and to the Adams Ranch. The advent of telephones, automobiles, and new farming equipment transformed the rhythms of rural life. Through it all, Garrett and Daria adapted together, maintaining the core traditions that had become sacred to their family while embracing progress where it made sense. On their 30th wedding anniversary, with Daniel now married and running part of the expanded ranch and Eva teaching at the local school, Garrett fulfilled a promise he had made to Daria years before. They journeyed to Bohemia, crossing the Atlantic on a steamship far more comfortable than the one that had brought Daria to America decades earlier. Standing in the small village where Daria had been born, Garrett watched his wife's face as she reconciled memories with present reality. Much had changed, but the church still stood, and the cemetery where her parents were buried remained a peaceful haven. They placed flowers on the graves and attended a Sunday service where the familiar prayers were spoken in the language that had become as natural to Garrett as his native English. "Strange," Daria remarked as they walked through the village square. "I thought I would feel more at home here, but it feels like visiting someone else's life now." Garrett understood. Home was their ranch in Idaho, the house they had expanded room by room as their family and prosperity grew, the community they had helped to build. Home was the place where English and Czech blended seamlessly in daily conversation, where Czech Christmas cookies were served alongside American apple pie, where their grandchildren now played in the yard where Daniel and Eva had once chased fireflies. They returned to Idaho with renewed appreciation for the life they had built together. The journey had completed a circle begun when Daria had stepped off that train as a young bride who couldn't speak a word of English, facing a husband who had decided, in that pivotal moment, that he would meet her halfway. In their golden years, as their hair silvered and their steps slowed, Garrett and Daria often sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching their grandchildren play while Daniel and his wife tended to the daily operations of the ranch. They would converse in their unique blend of languages, sometimes drawing curious looks from visitors unaccustomed to their linguistic dance. "Do you remember," Garrett asked one evening as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and purple, "that first day, when you arrived, and I realized you couldn't understand me?" Daria smiled, her eyes still bright in her lined face. "I remember being terrified. And then you tried to speak to me anyway, pointing at things, being so patient." "I was terrified too," he admitted. "I had no idea how we would manage." "But we did," she said simply, reaching for his weathered hand. Indeed they had. Their unusual beginning had forged a bond stronger than either could have imagined, a marriage built on patience, respect, and the willingness to learn each other's languages in every sense of the word. When Garrett Adams passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, the funeral service was conducted in both English and Czech, honoring the dual heritage he had embraced. Daria, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, listened as the pastor read from Garrett's favorite passage of Scripture, first in English, then in the Czech that her husband had learned for love of her. And when she joined him 3 years later, they were laid to rest together beneath a headstone that bore an inscription in both languages. "Love speaks in many tongues, but the heart always understands." The story of the cowboy who learned his bride's language instead of expecting her to abandon her own became part of local legend, passed down through generations of the Adams family and beyond. It stood as a testament to the power of love to bridge differences, to the courage of a young woman who had traveled to an unknown land, and to the wisdom of a man who had recognized that true communication began with meeting in the middle. In Idaho City and the surrounding countryside, where Czech words occasionally mingled with English in everyday speech, and where certain dishes on holiday tables could be traced back to Daria's recipes, the legacy of Garrett and Daria Adams lived on, a reminder that the greatest journeys we take are not across oceans or continents, but across the spaces between hearts, one word at a time.